York's classic rock, Q1043.
Happy New Year. Yeah, I could still say that. I want to tell you about a really special concert that's coming up Thursday, January 26th at City Winery. It's the first annual Songs of Deep Emotion and Bright Light, and it's to benefit the Nick Pagano LGBTQ plus scholarship fund for recovery. And joining me, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss. Rich Pagano is Nick's dad. You know him best as a drummer for the incredible Fab Faux. And first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I want you to tell Nick's story, your story too.
Well, Shelley, first of all, thanks for having me on this show. I'm a fan of this show, and also thanks for your words of compassion. My wife Karen and I are grateful that we had 20 incredible years with this boy. Yet, Nick suffered from anxiety and depression for most of his life. But through performing arts and also a wonderful family life and a wonderful extended family, Nick had in our opinion, a wonderfully enriched life. But when the teenage years kicked in, there was a level of self-doubt, and Nick went to the street, and Nick found friends that were also somewhat miserable, and at least they thought they were. And what started with THC spiraled to heroin. But and Nick spent 5 years, or we all spent 5 years crisscrossing the country, either getting Nick to treatment or picking him up from treatment to get to a sober living situation. And I'm very proud of our dedication and, of course, the compassion that we learned for this disease. January through June of 2021, Nick was sober for 6 months. And we had some incredible conversations while he was lucid. He hadn't been sober for more than 3 or 4 weeks prior to that for 5 years. But the crux here is, I would say at his 5th month, we took Nick out. Nick was living in Boston at the time at a sober living facility, sober living home, and doing outpatient treatment. And we sat in a restaurant, and Nick and my wife and I were talking about the Olympics and the whole transgender sort of taking part in sports. I guess at that point it was swimming. And the politics behind it, and he had strong opinions on it. We agreed with most, we disagreed on some points, but it was a wonderful conversation with a son that I hadn't had a conversation on that level for many years. He was incredibly smart, 10 times smarter than I was at his age, and incredibly enlightened. And Nick, of course, was gay, and then said that he'd like to start school. He had graduated high school. He'd like to start going back to a school and get his social worker's license and work in the LGBTQ community, primarily in the transgender community. And he actually said, Dad, in my community, the transgender gets no respect, and I'd like to do something about that. And I also would like to remain a welcoming entity at sober living situations and in treatment. Nick was the kid when he was sober in treatment, and he was in treatment many times. He was the kid who would notice if someone came in who was in the community, the LGBTQIA community, and he was the one who said, come on over here, we're doing this together. We'll get through it. And these two entities, Karen Treatment Centers and Release Recovery, remember that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At that lunch, Nick talked about exactly what his parameters were in moving ahead. and it resonated and it stayed with us. Unfortunately, about 3 weeks later, and I got into his phone after his death, and I saw the whole pathology of his spiral. And he had lost confidence. He was getting angry again. He was having a severe case of loneliness, which is very sad because, you know, he had an incredible community around him, sober community. And of course, his sponsor and his sober coach, and just young friends. And he went to the street and he went from a meeting with someone that once again was feeling the same way he was. And they started with a lighter drug and then went to a dealer. Unfortunately, that drug was laced with fentanyl. And Nick took it back to his sober house. And from what I'm told, we lost him peacefully. It was a minuscule amount of fentanyl, but when you're sober for 6 months and your body is so pure, granules on sitting on the top of the pinhead is all you need to end your life. So that was July 2nd of 2021. I had been in touch with, and my wife also, with all of the sober homes and treatment entities, and I had done a couple of benefits for sober living situations, sober living homes, because I saw that I saw the benefits of the step down. A 30-day program is wonderful. To go back to your life after 30 days is usually detrimental to your future. So the sober living environment certainly saved our son's life, or gave him a bit more longevity. So I did a couple of benefits here in New York City for a men's sober living home and also a women's sober living home in New York. And so Karen Treatment contacted us, Karen Treatment in Pennsylvania, and Release Recovery in Yorktown Heights. Now they're in New York City also. They remembered that Nick was a gentleman, a young gentleman of inclusion and acceptance, and that he, being a young actor, he had some success as an actor, that he knew how to command a room and corral people around him, and his charisma certainly lightened the mood. And they said that they said, listen, we would like to start the Nick Pagano LGBTQ Foundation for Recovery. We'd like to have it based out at Karen Treatment in Pennsylvania. And we'd like it to be the first of its kind. And I actually would like to, I have the exact comment that they said. Well, of course, if I could just read it just a second.
Sure.
So 1 month before Nick's accidental death due to fentanyl poisoning, we had this conversation that I just talked to you about, and it was mainly regarding the fear of ostracization and assumption of lack of communal inclusion within the treatment world. The foundation also deals with actually addresses stigma, heterosexism, internalized homophobia, and discrimination, as well as addiction. And I say that only because it really is the first of its kind to take on all of those elements. And it will eventually take over a wing at the treatment center.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary.
And here we are, by the way, 9 young adults in after a bit over a year of its inception. And all of the clients have moved on from the 30-day program at Karen Treatment and are residing in sober living homes. Most went on to Release Recovery, either in Yorktown Heights or in New York City, which is a sober living situation.
I am speaking to Rich Pagano. He is most well known as the drummer for Fab Faux. He tragically lost his son a year and a half ago to a fentanyl overdose. after being sober for quite some time. Unfortunately, we share a bond, Rich, in that a loved one of mine went through also a similar struggle with sobriety. And I think you can offer some insight and understanding to other parents who are going through this, because you never know if you're doing the right thing. You're told to set boundaries, but you don't want to cut yourself off. And
But
you want to help.
Yes, but unfortunately, and it is the hardest part, is that on a certain level, you have to cut yourself off. You become a trigger. Even if you're the most loving parent and there's no family trauma within the relationship, you become the trigger. You also become the endorphin rush that we found that after 3 years, when Nick was in need of filling the portal, so to speak, in need of the dopamine rush, the endorphin rush, just having a heated argument with my wife and I, that would actually satisfy the need. That would be an endorphin rush. So he would want our dynamic to escalate to a heated level. And when we were young parents, so to speak, and most parents are, hopefully you become enlightened, and I considered us to be incredibly enlightened parents, but you react, and reacting is part of the downfall. I remember our sober coach that we had, he was sort of a family sober coach. I had Post-its all over our house that would say, respond, do not react. Because when you diffuse the anger, the recovery does not, or the user, the substance use abuser, they can't harness the energy. And if they can't harness the energy, hopefully the dynamic de-escalates.
Okay, can you explain what you mean by respond and not react? What is the difference?
Well, I mean, it could be as simple as ransacking my son's room when he was 14. I wish I hadn't done that. I was trying to make a point. I was trying to position myself as sort of a soldier. Now, had I given him the option of giving me the drugs or taking a urine test, and what the consequences would be if the urine test was positive, that could have meant you have to leave, you have to go to a sober living environment, rather than it escalating and like I said, the ransacking or the arguing. I think that I could be wrong, but I think that we may have had more success early on, because when a substance use abuser is high, they, especially if it's oxys or Xanax, heroin is a whole different level. They want conflict, they want to feel, and they can also feel by your dynamic. So your dynamic with your child is very important. It's shifting down, not reacting. Sort of listing consequences either verbally or writing them out. Now, of course, when someone is using, that list means nothing. So it's up to you to follow through and make sure that the agreement remains. But keeping a peaceful home as best you can. If it gets violent, call the police. Back off, get out of your apartment, get out of your house, and call the police. That's also an important statement to make, that you are not going to tolerate, because it usually does get violent. I mean, when a user is coming down from a pill, they're miserable, and you become miserable, and you become reactive. And I felt that we were in that zone for a short period of time, because we got Nick into treatment at a very early age. I think when he was 15, he did his first 30-day program, and we had a wonderful teacher. And if I can add right now, and we don't have to go into this too much, but I've since become certified as a sober coach and a parent liaison because of the great teachers I've had that had the same certification.
You had what a lot of people don't realize who were fortunate not to go through this with someone they love. It's not like you go to rehab and it's once and done. For most people, it can take 12 times, maybe even more, and you're dealing with insurance. And then you mentioned dealing with a sober house where insurance will only enable the person to stay for so long. Seeing what you have seen over the last 5 years, well, now 6.5 years, in a perfect world, what sort of treatment should be available and for what length of time? Because I think part of the problem is this cutoff by insurance companies for those who cannot pay on their own, and it can be extraordinarily expensive.
Well, I do have a lot of criticism of the treatment world and the sober living world. There are some incredibly virtuous entities out there like Karen Treatment and Release Recovery, but there are some scams. There are the fact that some treatment centers don't take any insurance makes it nearly impossible for the average person to get the best treatment. And you want the best treatment. You want a reputable treatment center. And there are sober living situations that are sort of not on the up and up and are scams or have ulterior motives. Some of them are actually dealing. We've dealt with all of that. And fortunately, most of the time we found wonderful places for Nick. There may have been 2 or 3 where we had to get him out, or something had happened within the home, and it was just it was just a bad decision. But luckily he was with us for years after those situations. I do think that I wish the government would put more money, more funds towards treatment. See it as cancer. It is a disease like cancer. It's actually the only disease where you have a choice, that substance use disorder, where you, through talk therapy, I'm an advocate of the 12 steps, AA. I think they do work. You can keep yourself sober if you learn and understand your tools. With cancer, it's a crapshoot. You can go into remission. You can get that tumor back again. You can do everything possible to keep yourself healthy, but cancer is a whole different story. And as a matter of fact, when Nick was in Karen Treatment, a gentleman came in who was in remission from cancer, and he told the kids, "I wish I had your disease." It was very powerful at the time. But yeah, I wish that the government had more programs and also covered at least 30 days of inpatient treatment, and then options beyond that. But I also think that it takes people like us to create foundations and create opportunities to help people who cannot afford treatment to get to at least a 30-day program, and hopefully a step down after that.
So tell us about this big fundraiser you're having. It's the first annual Songs of Deep Emotion and Bright Light. It's coming up Thursday, January 26th at City Winery, and it's an all-star performance.
Well, I'm very fortunate that my friends who I've toured with or recorded with, and some who knew our son Nick, immediately said yes to being involved. And I can, with I call it grief brain, because my memory just goes south at any given moment, and that lasts for years, but it's something I'm dealing with. But on the bill, we have Rachel Yamagata, we have Roseanne Cash and John Leventhal, Kate Pearson, Ricky Byrd, Betty Levette, Willie Nile, Martha Redbone, Bobby Harden, David Driver, Steve Earle, who I'll say something about in a moment, and Marshall Crenshaw, and a few more guests too to be announced. People are jumping on daily. But Steve Earle was my neighbor here in Chelsea in New York City, and Steve lost his son just after we lost Nick. And I would see Steve in the mornings when I would be going for a run or sometimes even taking Nick to school. And when I saw Nick after his son died, we talked about doing something, but he was on tour or very busy with his other son, his younger son. And fortunately, about a year ago, we had this conversation to hopefully do this together. Steve is still with us. He couldn't remain a producer on the show because of his schedule, but he's deep in the trenches with me, and I'm grateful.
Wow. What a horrible thing to share. My God.
But Shelley, let me add, it is now, the silver lining is I'm supposed to be sharing this. I was supposed to go back to school to now work with parents.
Oh, so you went back to school to become a sobriety coach.
I'm just certified in the last few months. I spent
mazel tov.
Thank you. Look, I recommend that all parents should take a course in becoming a sober coach, whether they have a child with the affliction or not. What you learn about approach and tools just in your dynamic. I mean, look, I can say, yeah, I wish I knew this beforehand, but I did know plenty beforehand because of the training that we had during. But anyway, I'm proud and I'm grateful that the next part of my life is going to be about clinics. And I don't want to be in the trenches with the recovery. That might be too triggering for me. But the idea of working with a treatment center in a sober home and talking to parents and helping to give them guidelines, love with parameters and boundaries is something I look forward to.
So are you talking about being a sobriety coach for parents or for children or for both? And what does that entail?
Well, like I said, I would prefer to stay in the parent realm. I certainly am qualified to take meetings with the recovery, and I welcome it, but I think that my strengths are in sitting with the parents who are at any stage of their child's affliction, whether that be smoking weed, becoming what they call a wake and bake, not going to school, to pills, to positive drug tests, to homelessness, to a child being or a young adult being in treatment, and what the parents are going through, what parameters, what steps they should take to keep the family dynamic in a positive place. Because here's the important point. I feel that my wife Karen and I kept Nick alive at least an additional year through a whole renewed level of compassion, love, boundaries, and parameters. When Nick realized that his parents were deeply in love with him, regardless of what had happened, and we went through everything with regards to Nick's behavior and his actions. But when Nick realized that his parents' love was paramount, yet they were no longer going to be a safety net, he then embraced his sober community. Prior to that, he romanticized about his childhood life with us and also with his friends that he was using with. And all of those friends, of course, are married or in college and have moved on from the heavy drugs. It's a stage they went through, but they didn't have the switch. Nick had the switch. Nick had depression. Nick had anxiety. He was a perfect cocktail for this disease. But like I said, I think that with our education, it turned, especially in 2021, it turned our dynamic with Nick, drew us closer, and we became a certain partition in his life that he needed, rather than the all-encompassing, which is wrong at that point, because they certainly will turn to you for everything, and you cannot be everything. There's no way that you can control this disease. His community and his treatment is the answer, and it became the answer. And the friends that he made and the fellowships that he joined. Now, a fellowship, sobriety these days is very different. These kids are not going into church basements for meetings anymore. They're going in the back of a coffee shop and holding meetings. They're going in a part of a library. They're meeting in parks, and they develop these fellowships. So it was an incredible young and sort of fresh energy in sobriety, and he loved it because he was such a social butterfly. Of course, the pandemic was difficult for many of these young adults going through a level of treatment and sobriety, because you suddenly get back to your life when you come out of treatment. And to be able to sit in a coffee shop after meetings, or have meetings in a coffee shop, it really was, it was a wonderful period in Nick's life in 2020. When the pandemic came in, he spiraled severely. He was relapsing left and right. He was on the street. And fortunately, when it ended, he got back to a life that had a social element. If we could also talk about, if we had time, just the statistics of regarding this drug, fentanyl, and how many it's taken from us. I'd love to get into that, if that's okay.
We have about 3 minutes left, but before we get to
Sure.
that, how could people get tickets, or how can they donate to your scholarship fund?
Okay, so tickets will be at City Winery in New York. The show is January 26th, 8 p.m. sharp, because we have a lot of artists. And also, I'd like to add that there's a segment in the night that is an auction. And my wife is an art dealer and a gallery director here in New York at Howard Greenberg Gallery. And so she has curated maybe 10 pieces of art, all music related, that will be the centerpiece of the night. And a reputable auctioneer will be managing that part. Tickets at citywinery.com. And the songs of Deep Emotion and Bright Light, when you go on the site, should be easy to find for that. Or go on their calendar and look at January 26th.
And to donate to the fund, the scholarship fund?
Right, to donate, Karen.org. I should have had that in front of me.
And that's spelled C-A-R-O-N.
C-A-R-O-N, yes. Go to the Karen Treatment website and go to Foundations, and you'll see the Nick Pagano LGBTQ fund. Also, Release Recovery, the Release Recovery Foundation.org. They are also accepting donations. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we only have about a minute and a half left to go through the horrible statistics of fentanyl, and it's getting worse.
It's, yeah, and if I'll take a minute to say that there's not much we could do right now about what's coming over from China. Even I know that the Chinese government is trying to quell it, yet the Chinese gangs are compartmentalizing the fentanyl ingredients, which is legal. It's coming over to Mexico, and the Mexican gangs are then haphazardly mixing it together. And it's coming not by migrants, by the way. Migrants are not backpacking fentanyl over. It's actually being found at ports of entry. And it's getting in. It's even reams of paper are immersed in fentanyl and then reconstituted when it gets here. It's almost impossible to find. But what we can do is we can promote treatment, because if a child makes it through a fentanyl poisoning and gets into treatment, they will develop the tools to hopefully stay sober when they become tired of being sick and tired.
I thank you so much, Rich Pagano, for sharing your story and Nick's story with us. And again, the concert coming up for the Scholarship Fund, January 26th at City Winery. If you missed any part of this very important conversation, download the iHeartRadio app. It's free, and all of my interviews live in the podcast Sunstein Sessions. And I'll see you guys tomorrow morning on the Jim Kerr Rock and Roll Morning Show, Q104.3.
New York's classic rock, Q104.3.